I'd like to welcome all of you to the first meeting of the Socratic Club for this fall semester. Thanks for coming out at a time and place we aren't normally. The Socratic Club meets about once a month, and we normally are over in College Hall 101. There is an email listserv list going around the room. If you'd like to be on our email list just to have info about events, please do sign up. We take our name and inspiration from, if you're wondering, Socrates, what does it have to do with Socrates? We take our name and inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club of the 40s and 50s at Oxford University. That was presided over by very well-known Christian apologist C.S. Lewis. And the focus of the Oxford Socratic Club was to air basic issues of Christianity in an intellectual and philosophical context. And the Socratic Club was a really great forum where lots of big-name people of the day gathered together to discuss, argue in a very convivial spirit some basic issues about the nature of God, the question of truth, the problem of evil, etc., etc., etc. And we try to do that on a somewhat more modest scale, perhaps. The approach of the Gonzaga Socratic Club is to examine issues in the Christian worldview from a philosophical perspective, and we try in what we do here to replicate that great example of Lewis and the Socratic Club at Oxford. So thank you very much for coming. We have a very special speaker and topic today. We're going to be looking at vampire culture and how it sucks the life out of us. I notice your title said out of our children, but maybe it's sucking the life out of us and we're not aware of it. So our speaker today is Dr. Dan McInerny, who has had academic postings at a number of places, including Notre Dame and Baylor, but he is now a freed, independent scholar, writer, and author. He's coming out this fall with a children's adventure multimedia ebook that he'll also have a website for. And eventually, when that is booted, we'll put the link on the Gonzaga Socratic Club website so you can have some info about that. But he writes about art and culture as a philosopher. And he's going to be speaking again tonight, by the way. I want to make sure to put a plug for that. If you're willing to drive up the road to Whitworth, this event is part of the Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute's Faith, Film, and Philosophy Conference. And I want to actually express my gratitude to Dr. Clayton and the Faith and Reason Institute for making it possible for us to have a guest speaker of Dr. McInerny's quality and caliber here. So let's welcome him, Vampires.
And of course, Socrates was a vampire. The cave, right? Yeah. Don't you teach them subtlety of interpretation? It's great to be with you this afternoon to talk about this topic. I don't think I have to lecture a crowd most in sort of what I think of as the young adult demographic here about the impact that vampire literature, television shows, and movies have had in the last, 5 years or so upon our popular culture. You know its impact better than I do. I am quite sure. It's massive. If you go into the young adult section of your Barnes & Noble, and before you even get close to the stacks, you can just see the spines of the books are almost uniformly black and gothic before you even see the titles. The Twilight series, I think, is still, at least in its cinematic iteration, I think it's still lively, right? I think we're waiting for the last film in the series to come out, if I'm not mistaken. The wave may have crested a bit, the current wave, but it's going to come again, as it has in the past in popular culture. Professor Calhoun and I were talking about the significance in the 80s and 90s of Anne Rice's vampire novels. And I was remembering when I was growing up in the early 70s, the television show that my mother would let me watch when I got home from school was Dark Shadows, featuring vampire Barnabas Collins. And of course, we can go back to Bram Stoker's Dracula in, what, 1897 or so, and we can see that in popular culture, the phenomenon of the vampire comes in waves. I want to talk about the current wave, most of all with you this afternoon, but in order to understand the current wave, we do need to go back in time and understand an older vampire story. But before I get to the stories themselves, I want to talk a little bit more generally about why human beings have fascination with the vampire to begin with. Here's some images that I'm sure are familiar to many, if not most of you. I think we have to begin thinking about the presence of the vampire in popular culture by keeping in mind that the vampire, to put it most bluntly, is an image of Satan. It's the first thing I want to offer to you. The vampire is an image of Satan. In fact, if we read Dante's Inferno, we get down to Canto 34, which is the last canto in the Inferno. We see Dante as he's looking upon Satan, and that image of Satan might not be the most familiar one to you, is an image of Dante's Satan. You see he's three-faced. He's devouring on three poor souls, one of whom is Judas Iscariot. He has wings. And if you've read through Dante, you know that he's buried hip deep in ice. Ice, not fire. And here's how Dante describes his experience of seeing Satan in Anthony Esselin's translation. How faint I then became, how turned to ice, reader, ask not. I will not write it down, for any words I used would not suffice. I did not die, did not remain alive. Think for yourself if wisdom buds in you what I became, deprived of life and death. Isn't that the condition of a vampire? I'm not saying that Dante is explicitly alluding to the figure of a vampire, but I think the characteristics that we associate with vampirism are present here in the description of Satan and in the description of his own experience as he looks upon Satan. He finds himself almost kind of taking on the characteristics of the satanic monster in front of him, a being who is neither quite dead nor quite alive. The author George Bernanos made an interesting sort of comparison between, or we can make an interesting sort of comparison between what Bernanos says about the Blessed Virgin and the vampire. About the Blessed Virgin, Bernanos said that she was younger than sin. But the vampire is not younger than sin due to grace and holy simplicity, but he's preternaturally youthful by being a predator, the very opposite of the Blessed Virgin. You may have heard of the film director Guillermo del Toro. He was the director of Pan's Labyrinth. He also writes certain Gothic tales with his partner Chuck Hogan. This excerpt is from an op-ed piece that they wrote for the New York Times a couple summers ago, trying to put and this I think was at the very crest of the wave of the current vampire phenomenon. And they tried to put their finger on the fact of why vampires are so perennially powered our minds. And Del Toro and Hogan write, in contrast to timeless creatures like the dragon, the vampire does not seek to obliterate us, but instead offers a peculiar brand of blood alchemy. For as his contagion bestows its nocturnal gift, the vampire transforms our vile mortal selves into the gold of eternal youth and instills in us something that every social construct seeks to quash, primal lust. Through the panacea of its blood, the vampire turns the lead of our toxic flesh into golden matter. There's a strange combination that I don't think my mind has gotten to the bottom of, but when it comes to the vampire, there's a strange combination of sex and death intertwined with one another. And that, I think, is what Del Toro and Hogan are trying to get at here. But in order to take this analysis further and think why the vampire has become so popular and what's happening to the image of the vampire in our culture, I want to take a look briefly with you at 3 vampire stories. The first is one I gather most, if not all of you, have not heard of. John William Polidori's The Vampire, which I'm pretty darn sure it was the first vampire story written in English, written by Polidori in 1819. And we have more. Then I want to zoom up a century and talk about Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series, focusing especially on the first volume of that series. And then lastly, I want to take a look at the recent film, vampire film, Let Me In, directed by Matt Reeves, written and directed by Matt Reeves. And in looking at these stories, I want to trace kind of a cultural trajectory. And that trajectory, in short, is this. In Polidori's tale, the vampire is a satanic figure. The vampire is evil. The vampire is a nemesis that is to be destroyed. In Stephenie Meyer's tale, the vampire, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, the vampire has become something different altogether. The vampire has become, far from being satanic and evil, the vampire has become a romantic hero. But then when we get to Let Me In, right, made just a couple of years ago, we find a very different vampire still. And I think the most disturbing vampire of the 3. And that is a vampire that is a child. That is what is most striking, what is most distinctive about this film. In Polidori's tale, the child, or at least the young adult, is the innocent victim to the vampire. But by the time we get to Let Me In, the figure who usually is the most innocent in a tale, the child, is the vampire. And more importantly, all sense of evil, of good and evil, seems to have been obliterated from that world. There's really no distinction or a fast disappearing distinction between predator and victim. And so the upshot of this cultural trajectory is that we go from tales where the distinction between good and evil is pretty well marked to a kind of tale where distinction between good and evil is non-existent. And that's troubling, in fact chilling. But I think that's where this most recent iteration of the vampire phenomenon has taken us. But let's look at each of these tales a little bit more. Anybody here ever hear of Polidori's tale, The Vampire? Have you heard it? Okay. If it's not that long, right? It's kind of a longish short story, really. And you can read it in an afternoon. It's quite enjoyable. Got a great ending. Let's talk a little bit about it. Lord Byron on the prowl. I'm going to skip up over this and get right to this. In 1819, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley, William Polidori, and another woman, Claremont, met at the Villa Diodati here in Geneva. This was kind of their vacation place. And while they were there, they were reading ghost stories. And they were having so much fun that they initiated a contest where each one was going to write a ghost story of his or her own. Now, the most famous story that came out of that contest was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In fact, I'm sure when the contest was initiated, people thought it was going to be a contest between Byron and Shelley, the two most famous writers. It was really Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that captured popular attention after that. Polidori was there as Byron's doctor. He was a physician by trade, and he was traveling through Europe with Byron. And he was in on the contest, and Polidori wrote his own tale, The Vampire. Now, it wasn't long after this sojourn in Geneva that Byron and Polidori sort of had something of a falling out. It might have even been over the fact that Polidori's tale cribs its plot from Byron, from the story that Byron was writing and never really completed. Polidori's tale sort of takes the plot and situation and expands on it in his own story. That might have been the source of their falling out. In any event, Polidori finished his tale, The Vampire, and publishes it. And what's interesting is that the vampire at the center of his story has a remarkable resemblance to Lord Byron himself. In fact, it's not a bad place to begin thinking about this vampire phenomenon, is thinking about Lord Byron, sort of the Platonic form, as it were, of romantic poet, of romantic hero. The hero of Polidori's story is called Lord Strongmore. Let's take a look first at this description of what the Byronic hero, the romantic hero, means for literature. This is from Macaulay's Oxford Illustrated History of English Literature. The Byronic hero is proud, moody, cynical, with defiance on his brow and misery in his heart, a scorner of his kind, implacable in revenge, yet capable of deep and strong affection. You think of your literature courses, this is the anti-hero. This is a character that comes down to us in many different sorts of stories that we're well familiar with. Think of Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, right? Not a vampire, but certainly a descendant of the Byronic or romantic hero. So Polidori is thinking of the character of Byron. He's thinking of these sorts of qualities that Byron exudes, and he begins to associate those qualities, interestingly enough, with a monster. This is how he describes Lord Strongmore, his vampire, in the tale. He has a dead gray eye with the serpent's arc. He has a mysterious power over other people. He makes a pretense of virtue among the virtuous. He gives money to profligates. But he's most known for the fact that he preys upon women, innocent women. His main desire is to spoil feminine virtue. And one wonders whether Polidori is drawing on experience of Byron behind closed doors at the Villa Diodati. It's an interesting combination. Sex and death would be the twin notes of the phenomenon, even going back to Polidori. Here's another excerpt. It had been discovered, talking about Lord Strongmore, that his contempt for the adulteress had not originated in hatred of her character, but that he had required to enhance his gratification that his victim, the partner of his guilt, should be hurled from the pinnacle of unsullied virtue, down to the lowest abyss of infamy and degradation. In fine, that all those females whom he had sought, apparently on account of their virtue, had since his departure thrown even the mask aside and had not scrupled to expose the whole deformity of their vices to the public view. So the women he abuses then make a great show of being less than virtuous. That's the real effect of his vampirism, is to turn them into morally evil persons and people who glory in moral evil. So that's interesting. It's an interesting place to start. But now we go up to the second tale, the Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series, and we see a very, very different kind of vampire. I think it's very significant that the title of this first book is Twilight. And when I was first thinking about these issues, and I was reading Polidori and I was reading Stephanie Meyer, I came upon this line in Polidori's tale. And he's talking about Italy at this point. And he says, twilight in these southern climates is almost unknown. Immediately the sun sets and night begins. And that image otherwise would not have jumped down at me if I wasn't reading Twilight. I just thought it fascinating that Polidori is talking about twilight. And it seems to be that the point of the image here is that there's a clear distinction between light and dark in the atmosphere here in Italy. And maybe we could extrapolate and talk about a clear distinction between good and evil. But Stephanie Meyer chooses to call her first volume and the series the Twilight series, which seems to indicate we don't have such a contrast of light and dark, but we're in a gray area, morally speaking, most importantly. And that's interesting. The cover of the first book in the series is also very important. Perhaps you never thought about the significance of this, but you have an apple. And of course, the association is with the apple in the Garden of Eden. And what is that all about? Let's take a look at a clip from Twilight, though, before we go deeper. Raise your hand if you've read the books, or at least some. Raise your hand if you've seen the movies, at least some. Let's take a look at a pivotal scene in the first film. This is where Edward and Bella, Edward, of course, is the vampire. This is where Edward and Bella sort of first achieve their understanding. They express their love, and also they come to terms with the fact that they are ill-suited for each other at a certain level. So let me go to the DVD.
Yeah, it's just gone to sleep.
Yeah. Just gonna keep this up again. Is that too loud? If you want to cut the lights in back, that's great. Yeah.
You're impossibly fast and strong. Your skin is pale white and ice cold. Your eyes change color. And sometimes you speak like you're from a different time. You never eat or drink anything. You don't go out in the sunlight. How old are you?
17.
How long have you been 17?
A while.
I know what you are.
Say it. Out loud. Say it.
Vampire.
Are you afraid?
No.
Then ask me the most basic question. What do we eat?
You won't hurt me. Where are we going?
Up and out. Out of the cloud bank. You need to see what I look like in the sunlight. This is why we don't show ourselves in sunlight. People wouldn't know we're different. What I have.
It's like diamonds. You're beautiful.
Beautiful. This is the skin of a killer. I'm a killer.
I don't believe that.
It's because you believe the lie. It's camouflage. I'm the world's most dangerous predator. Everything about me invites you in. My voice, my face, even my smell. As if I would need any of that. As if you could outrun me! As if you could fight me off. I'm designed to kill.
I don't care.
I've killed people before.
It doesn't matter.
I wanted to kill you. I've never wanted a human's blood so much in my life.
I trust you.
Don't.
I'm here. I trust you.
My family, we're different from others of our kind. We only hunt animals. We learn to control our thirst. But it's you. You can't. It's like a drug to me. Like my own personal brand of heroin.
Why did you hate me so much when we met?
I did. Only for making me want you so badly. I still don't know if I can control myself.
I know you can.
I can't read your mind. You have to tell me what you're thinking.
Now I'm afraid.
Good.
I'm not afraid of you. I'm only afraid of losing you. I feel like you're going to disappear.
I don't know how long I've waited for you. So the lion fell in love with the lamb.
What a stupid man.
You sick, masochistic lion.
that there. You'd see that in Edward Cullen, we at least have visually the image of the Byronic, of the romantic hero. You have the quintessentially tall, dark, and handsome man. He's a loner. He's brooding. He's alienated. Insofar as that goes, we're still in the tradition of the vampire that Polidori was working with, but that's really only a surface comparison. I think the image of the vampire has changed dramatically here. And I think it's best to understand that in light of what Stephanie Myers is doing with the story of the fall. Clearly in this scene, both Edward and Bella are struggling against prohibitions. Edward the vampire by nature, he wants to bite her, change her into a vampire. That's what his nature is made to do. She's a human being. She is made to run from a predator. But here, the point of the scene is that they achieve a certain kind of friendship. They express their love. She at least expresses her trust in him. And the prohibitions are cast aside. And that's very interesting. It's especially interesting if you keep in mind the fact that Stephanie Myers herself is a Mormon, and she's thinking about the fall specifically through the Mormon understanding of the fall, which is not the Christian one. If you really want to get up to speed quickly on this issue, I want to recommend this article to you. You can Google it and download it for free off the internet. It's by a fellow named John Granger, and it's called Mormon Vampires in the Garden of Eden. It was published by Touchstone magazines a couple years ago. And it's really good on how Stephanie Myers is using images from her Mormon faith in constructing this tale of Twilight. And the only detail from that, again, I want to pick up on is the fact that for Mormons, the fall was not a negative thing. Now, in Orthodox Christianity, in the long view, the fall was not a negative thing either, in the sense that it made possible the incarnation of Christ and our redemption in Christ. It's a happy fall from a long view. But that isn't to say that the actual sin of Adam and Eve was good or should have happened in the hard moral sense. No, it was sin. It was a trespass against God's prohibition. But Mormons, as far as I understand, don't see it that way. The trespass actually was a good thing. And Adam himself is not the Adam of traditional Christianity. Adam himself is a divine or quasi-divine figure. And you can see that in the figure of Edward here. When he shows himself in the sunlight and his skin sparkles, she says he's beautiful. He's even more God. It's kind of an apotheosis there. He's even more godlike. So we have this image of the fall where to break through barriers, to disobey, is actually a good thing. And for Mormonism, the fall makes possible the union of man and woman. Procreation isn't even possible before the fall. So the fall makes possible sexuality, procreation, and family life. One of the things that the Twilight series has become most famous for is the fact that Edward and Bella's love is relatively chaste, right? You see that. That's why I wanted to show the last few seconds of that. You see them literally lying side by side, and isn't it the case that Edward sort of sits by her bedside, right, every night, watching over her, protecting her? It's an interesting twist on sort of Polidori's vampire as sexual predator. Right? Here, he's more or less chaste, and their love, as the series goes on, as we find out, leads to marriage and to children. So all this is to say that Mormonism is being filtered by all of the images from Twilight. But I don't want to belabor that too much, because I think it's the rare reader who is reading the Twilight series for its Mormon symbolism. And I don't think that symbolism is the reason why it has so captivated most readers. I think the reason for that is much more straightforward. And I think it comes down to the fact that the Bionic Hero, whom Edward represents, is a compelling figure in works of narrative art. It wasn't just Stephanie Meyer who realized that the tall, dark, handsome, brooding, alienated loner in the dark leather jacket is an attractive figure. And that's always going to be compelling. I think that's a big part of it. But even more important than that, it's a love that, what's the word I want? It's a love that is willing to do anything to survive. Even if you don't get into the Mormon understanding of the fall, you know, at least from that kind of scene, that they're willing to chuck. I mean, Bella's ready to chuck the whole way of being human and date a vampire. And Edward, for his part, and his family are willing to chuck how vampires usually live in order for their love to be together. Again, eros and death, sex and death, right? Even if the sex isn't consummate here, are intertwined in the phenomenon. And that, I think, explains the popularity of the series. It's a love that will do anything in order to live, in order to survive. And that's a compelling theme, I think, is always a compelling theme for human beings. But the last story I want to share with you, again, the most disturbing one of the three, Let Me In. It's based on the book Let the Right One In by the Swedish author John Lundqvist. It was made into a movie in Sweden, which I haven't seen, called Let the Right One In, but when they made the American version of it with Matt Reeves, they changed it to Let Me In, and Matt Reeves kind of did his own screenplay off the book. So there are two very recent film adaptations of the same book. Raise your hand if you've seen Let Me In. Yeah, it's a much rarer movie. I'm going to show you at least, instead of trying to summarize the plot, I'm just going to show you the 2-minute trailer. I think that's kind of enough to sort of get the bare bones of the plot, and then I want to make a couple of points about it. So I'm going to take this off of YouTube.
As some of you may have heard, there was an incident last night. One of your recent graduates here was killed. In the meantime, we need you all to be on the lookout for any suspicious activity.
You guys just moved in. How do you know? I live next door to you. What happened there? Some kids from school? I'll help you. But you're a girl. I'm a lot stronger than you think I am. Can you hear me through the wall? Only sometimes.
I found a body a few days ago. Victim completely drained of blood. Please don't see that boy again.
Where's your dad? He pissed on my dad. What was that? What was going on?
Hello?
What are you? Really? I need blood to live.
Hey there. You okay? There's a whole lot more than just what's been going on around here. This goes way back, other states, other cities.
I have to go away.
Maybe you got something you want to tell me?
Do you think there's such a thing as evil?
is out on, it's out on DVD now. I think it came out in February of this year. So if you can see it, though, it's a pretty chilling film. It's stuck.
As some of you may have heard, there was an incident last.
You trying to get back to your PowerPoint? There you go.
Okay.
You're good.
So the little boy is Owen. The little girl is Abbey. Owen is at a point in his life where he's feeling quite lonely and sad. His parents are in the middle of divorce, and he's just moved with his mother into this very drab and dreary apartment complex that you saw some images of. And Abbey and her parent, father, also live in the apartment complex, and she's a rather sad and lonely waif herself, and they form a friendship out in the playground area of this apartment complex. And as Owen slowly learns, Abbey herself is a vampire. Her father is not her father, he's more of a caretaker. And he is the one who secures her victims for her. She doesn't actually go out on the prowl. Normally he brings the blood to her from people that he murders. And we caught a clip of the detective saying this goes back to other towns, other states. This has been going on for some while. Like Edward, she's not literally 9 years old, but she's been 9 years old for some time. Very strange. Like in Twilight, you have a love story, although here we're talking about 9-year-olds, so it's puppy love, but you have a kind of a love story. But whereas in Twilight we saw this kind of romantic gush, you have sort of the erotic ideal being consummated in marriage and family life. Here, you have the little girl vampire, in the end, simply making a new caretaker out of Owen the little boy. Because, not to go into all the nuances of the plot, but her father caretaker is killed in the story, and she needs a new one. Now, again, like Twilight, Abbey is somewhat attached to Owen, though she doesn't make a meal out of him, as it were. She resists. So there is perhaps some kind of human feeling operated here. But in effect, she's a child predator. And she protects Owen. In fact, in one of the climactic scenes in the movie, there's been some bullies who have been tormenting Owen throughout the whole movie. And in the end, they're tormenting him. They're kind of dunking him into a pool. They're basically drowning him. And Abbey, the vampire, comes to his rescue, and she just takes out about 4 boys, just destroys them. And by that point, she has to go on the run. She's been discovered by the authorities. And the closing scene of the movie is wow. It's her and Owen is on a train. They're leaving town alone together. He's got her in a kind of a suitcase, and he's her new caretaker, and they're heading to the next town. And I understand the film is saying that Owen is simply going to grow older and become the old new caretaker that we saw at the beginning of the movie. So this isn't Twilight. There's not going to be this comic ending that ends in marriage. It's just the next caretaker that comes along. I want to take a look at the screenplay, just a couple of spots of the screenplay. You can get this online if you're interested. This is a point in the story where Owen calls his dad, who's not living with at the time, but he's beginning to discover what Abbey is all about, and he is scared. And he calls his dad for a lifeline. He needs some help here. Good instinct, call dad. His mom is not really functioning well as a mother. I think she's been drinking a lot. She's also portrayed as kind of a fundamentalist Christian. she's not on the spot to be very helpful. So here's Owen's call to his dad. First of all, I think a woman answers, and then Dad comes on the phone, says, "Can I talk to you a minute?" Can you see that? Is that visible? And the man's voice says, "Sure, pal, what is it? What's wrong?" And Owen starts to speak. He starts to cry. He says, "I don't know." "What? Do you think, is there such a thing as evil?" Owen asks. "What? Can people be evil? Is that true? Is that real?" I mean, his best friend has just revealed herself as a vampire. He wants to know how he's supposed to think about this. And the father says, "What are you talking about, pal? I don't know what you're talking about. Did something happen? Where are you getting all this?" And he starts to blame his wife. "From your mother? All her religious crap?" And Owen says, "No." He says, "Don't listen to that shit, okay?" And Owen says, "No, that's not." But his father isn't listening. He's asking about the meaning of good and evil, and the father can't hear the question, much less offer a reply. The mother's Christianity doesn't have any impact on Owen. He can't turn to her for help. So the traditional figures of moral formation, of parents, of religion, are not functioning in Owen's life. He has no signposts to lead him on this way. And again, I take it that the film is telling us we don't know the answer to the question of good and evil. It seems to me that we don't have an answer to that question. There are predators in life. And in a sense, we're all predators. There's a great scene, it's up on page 845. Let me just go up there quickly. Where Abbey and Owen are talking. And Owen asks her there at the top, "Who are you?" And she looks at him, a defiant look in her eye. And it's just interesting, the first thing she says is, "I'm just like you." And again, on the surface level, you interpret that as saying, "I'm just a kid like you. I didn't do this to myself," which she didn't. She didn't make herself a vampire. There's a flashback at one point where you kind of see it happening to her. She is a victim. So in a sense, she's just like you. But I take it again a little deeper and say that I'm a predator. And you're a predator too. If you keep going in this script, this comes out a little bit more explicitly. Owen says, "What do you mean?" Abbey stares at him, her demeanor changing. She steps slowly forward, hovering menacingly, brandishing an imaginary knife. What she's doing is she's mocking Owen. She's imitating what she saw him doing in sort of the courtyard or playground of the apartment complex before they first met. He was mad at the bullies who were teasing him. He was pretending to kill them. And she's imitating that here, brandishing an imaginary knife. "What's the matter?" She's quoting. Are you scared? Are you scared, little girl? Huh?" And Owen says, "What are you doing?" Abbey says, "These are the first words I ever heard you say outside." She's saying, "You're a predator too, just like me." But Owen says, "I don't kill people," but you'd like to, if you could, to get back at them. And it doesn't strike me that the movie really undercuts that sentiment. No, Owen isn't yet a vampire, but in fact, these human beings are really no different than Abbey. And there's no, I think, moral comment. There's no, what's the word I want? There's no contrary moral comment to that final image of Owen and Abbey going off together. That's just the way the world is now. So in looking at these three vampire stories again, I tried to trace a trajectory. In the very first vampire story in English, Polidori's The Vampire, we sort of had traditional categories of good and evil in play. The vampire is a romantic hero, but he's very much a predator. His bite is kind of a sign of his being a sexual predator. In the Twilight series, the predator becomes a full-blown romantic hero. And Bella's job is to is to disobey, to fall into love with him. A love that eventually leads to marriage and family life. But in the last story, Let Me In, all that romantic sentiment has disappeared from the world of the vampire. And we have the vampire as predator again. And there's no solace. And what's especially eerie to me is that the innocent victim that we begin with in Polidori's tale, the young virtuous women he was attacking, those very women in the younger Abbey are now the vampires themselves. Thank you very much for your attention. Love to take your questions. Yeah. Rebuttals. Outrage from fans of Twilight. Yes.
Do you think there's some sort of rhetorical appeal occurring in these movies with the sort of breakdown of morality?
Yes. But tell me what you mean by rhetorical appeal.
Do you think that they're trying to convince us of something?
The they being which? Are you talking about the three stories I mentioned? Or?
Yeah, let's just say the authors of these stories.
Yeah. Yes, but let's be careful. The grouping of these three together is my doing, right? So we have to ask, what do the authors themselves think that they're doing, right, as sort of moral comment? I do think that Polidori was making a negative moral comment about Lord Byron and the vampire, right? I think he also just wanted to write a good Gothic tale, but I think there was a little bit of a poke he was making at Lord Byron. And I do, however self-conscious or not it was, I think he is expressing an anxiety about this figure of a man who knows no moral boundaries. That's monstrous, it seems to me, that story is telling. That's a moral comment. And as I was saying, Stephanie Meyer has her own moral comment. It's a very different sort of one. Where again, the vampire is an image of a Byronic or romantic hero, but he's now an ideal. I mean, he's a predator, but he's one we can live with. He's one we want to live with. In fact, he's godlike. It's a very different sort of moral take. And then you get this almost nihilistic moral view. Not almost. You get a nihilistic moral view in Let Me In, where there's you really don't know what good and evil are. So you get three very different moral comments. They're not all three saying the same thing at all. So I don't know if that addresses your question.
Well, I mean, you've shown the trajectory. My question for you is, very respectfully,
Yeah.
So what?
Okay. So, okay, good. Always a good question. So what for what? For whom? I mean, what is the so what direct at? So what
Just-
for the culture?
Just in general, what is your point by painting out this
Okay.
trajectory? What
Okay.
is your point?
I think it's chilling. I have a deep concern about any stories dealing with a monstrous figure that doesn't see that figure as a monster. And that's especially true in the latter two. Right? Again, the categories of good and evil, traditional ones that you see in Dante, for example, where he looks on Satan, and Satan is Satan. And we know where we stand in relationship to him. In Twilight and in Let Me In, that distinction is played with and ultimately completely blurred and obliterated. Right? That's the upshot. That's the punchline. Does that make some sense?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. That's great.
What direction do you think vampire culture is headed toward in the future? I mean, because Let Me In obviously wasn't as near as popular as Twilight. I mean, do you see it
Yeah.
more going in the direction of Let Me In, darker, or do you see it more
Yeah,
like
that's a
just
good question.
romantic thriller? That's, you know. Because Twilight didn't just have like a profound impact as far as vampire tales go. It's had a profound impact on what a girl wants in a guy nowadays.
Sure.
Which
Yeah.
I'm sorry, the portrait of Edward is completely unrealistic, and that's not how a guy should act. He shouldn't be.
Sure. Right.
Not everyone wants that.
I'm not saying everyone wants that, but that's become like.
But he plays the piano.
But it's like it's almost a generalized idea.
Yes. That's a great question. It's hard. I mean, I want to start with "Let Me In" and call it a nihilistic tale. By that, I simply mean that it's doing away with the traditional categories of good and evil. It's hard to know where you go in storytelling after that. Now, you're very astute to notice that's still, even in our culture, which in my opinion is pretty far advanced in decline, that kind of story is still not the most popular, and it'll probably never be the most popular in any culture. The most popular story is the Twilight story. And that's at least a sign of a certain amount of health, in that at least there's love of some brand involved in Twilight. And I think young people, I know this is anecdotal perhaps, but I think young people are sort of curious, if not attracted, by the fact that their love is chaste. And that here's a man,
But it's not really chaste, because towards the end of the series, the reason they don't make it unchaste is because they're afraid he's going to eat her.
Yeah.
That's the reason why their love doesn't become
Right.
chaste. It's not for any religious or moral reasons. If he would not eat her, they would not have had a chaste love.
Right. Excellent point. I guess I was just thinking of that initial story. But you're absolutely right. But there is in him, I mean, again, that romantic hero is always going to be attractive. And so I think we're going to see, new waves of that story. I think we'll see stories like Let Me In. I think the real question in my mind is, are we ever going to see a story like Polidori's again? Are we ever going to see a story like Bram Stoker's again?
So you more see it as a hybrid going into the future of Twilight?
Not so much a hybrid. I think we're going to still see sort of the romantic version and sort of the gory nihilistic version. I think those are going to go on. I think that the sort of tale where the vampire is labeled a monster is gone. One thing I didn't mention, I would add, it's an interesting counterpoint to all this is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, which is a great comment on sort of the destructive effects of Gothic literature on the young. And there's even a kind of, not a literal vampire, but sort of a sort of vampiric figure in Captain Tilney's father. Is it Admiral Tilney? So if you're interested in sort of these types of stories, Austen's story is a great counterpoint to it, where a young woman needs to learn how not to be so enraptured by Gothic literature. Bella would have benefited. Though what's really wild is that Jane Austen's a big theme in the first Twilight, and Stephanie Meyer she's trying to write a Pride and Prejudice with vampires, but I don't think. But she was too late. Well, I don't think she understands Jane Austen. I think all she understands is sort of the romantic element in Jane Austen. I don't think she understands the way that virtue is sort of what makes romantic love most valuable. At least I think she could have a deeper understanding of that. But that kind of tale, I think we're gonna lose. But I think the Twilight sort of will always come, and the Let Me Ins might come even in greater abundance in our culture. So that's a great question. Yeah. Yes.
They now have a series on Disney Channel called My Babysitter is a Vampire. It's a comedic show from what I've heard. So do you think it's come to a point in vampire
history?
Yeah, where it's no longer vampires are evil, it's just normal?
Yeah, and that's not so recent. I mean, my kids laugh because I found a box with all my little kid drawings in it, and there was a book I had made. I'd stapled the binding, and it was called Danny and the Monsters. and you know, Frankenstein and Dracula and the werewolf were all sort of part of the story. I was fascinated by those sorts of figures. They're figures of fun at a certain level, because we just have an interest in the macabre. We have an interest in lives that are just dramatically different from ours. And I don't think that, I mean, I don't know if I want my kids watching that show. They were young enough to enjoy the show. But I don't find that so disturbing. A little disturbing, not so disturbing. In the way that I'm not so disturbed that we enjoy a movie called Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, we enjoy some bad guys. We enjoy the macabre, the gothic. That's always going to be around. At the same time, I've noticed kind of the same thing you notice, not just in what's young adult literature, which is teen to late teen, early teen to late teen, but in real children's literature, more and more vampire stories, and now even have cartoons. So I'm not saying I'm okay with that. It is disturbing. But I guess I'm saying I don't think the intentions are always so deep. I think they need a fun new character. And hey, vampires are hot, let's choose the vampire. There's a lot of that, a lot of bandwagon activity going on too. These are really trying, I think, to say something morally and culturally, or they do say something morally and culturally that's deep and I think is worth reflection. So, good question. Yes, sir.
Sorry if my question's a little unorganized. I'm trying to formulate something going here, but I kind of want to challenge you on the description of Twilight.
Yeah.
To me, it almost seems like you could look at it not as a depiction of, you know, the fall when they're in the Mormon conception of the fall there, but rather as an eschatological situation where, and just, you know, seeing that scene immediately made me think of, and I can't, you know, quote the exact verse, but the lion laying down with the lamb, the eschatological picture of the end times, but also the fact that Edward, whatever, I can't remember what his stepfather was a son of an English
Carlisle.
Carlisle. He was a son of a pastor. And it almost seems like there's this introduction of grace into this particular family of vampires that allows them to overcome the sinfulness of their nature.
Yeah.
It almost seems like you could build it as if the vampires are the true depiction of human nature and not the people in the story.
Yeah.
Then it seems like an overcoming of sin and almost an eschatological picture.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could laminate that schema over it and make some sense out of it that way. I think I've read too much about what Stephanie Meyer has said about the Mormon imagery of the work to think that that's what she thinks she's doing. I mean, the lion is lying down with the lamb, but again, we have to read that through her Mormon understanding of the fall. And that entails, again, a disobedience that is good. And that's just a radical break from Christianity. And so I find that kind of disturbing. But also think, okay, but even on taking your view, what do you got when the lion lies down with the lamb? You've got, well, I guess you could keep going with your analysis and say, well, we've got ultimately a kind of marriage. Maybe it wasn't perfectly chaste leading up to it, but it eventually ends up in a kind of marriage. She eventually becomes a vampire, right? So they attain a kind of divinity or semi-divinity at the end. They have a child. They overcome the Volturi, who have Roman Catholic overtones associated with them, and they kind of achieve this, I don't know, graced situation. Again, I think you have to impose that on it. I think it's if you're going to bring a theology into it, it has to be the Mormon one to make sense of what she's doing. And I don't know. If you want to come back, please do. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think in order to make that argument, you have to divorce Stephanie Meyer's statements outside of the books from the actual work of literature.
Yeah.
But I was just interested in your.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can see that all the pieces fit when you lay that out. What sticks in my craw though is it's him as the romantic figure. I don't know. I have to think about it some more. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is going to swing in an interesting or a different direction, but you briefly mentioned alchemy, the Del Toro book. Right?
Yeah.
And then you also brought in the Dante's comedy. Is that, are you familiar with the psychosexual alchemy, like Negredo, Albano, Rubeno?
No.
It's the flesh becoming purified through the process of putrefaction and then spiritualizing. It's kind of I guess a mystic idea, but in the Inferno.
Let me watch Dark Shadow. So
sure. You mentioned Satan as being analogous to a vampire figure, right? He's consuming. Consuming. He's at the very bottom of Casitas, the lowest level of hell. And he's consuming evil in its purest form. And I thought, well, isn't that kind of like a suckerfish, like in the tank? You know, it's cleaning things out. Because right behind Satan, right, is the tunnel that leads up to
Mount Purgatory.
Purgatory, right? Purgatory, and starts the spiritualizing process. So would the comedy even work if there wasn't a Satan figure to clean things out?
Good, excellent point. It wouldn't from Dante's point of view, right? It's Dante who is gaining self-knowledge as he gazes upon Satan there in the pit of hell. And see, that whole descent into hell is getting him ready for his purification, as he's seeing evil for what it truly is. The purification proper begins as he ascends Mount Purgatory. That doesn't mean, though, so again, in a sense, the descent into evil is required. But that's a far cry from saying that the evil itself is something good, right? That doesn't mean Satan in and of himself is a good thing, or that sin in and of itself is a good thing. It's just that in order to be purified, Dante needs to see sin for the real evil that it is.
To see as it is.
Yeah.
The knowledge of good and evil that comes
not to see it as good, not to see it as pleasure, not to see it as fun.
So this current culture of death, maybe swing over to Socrates, like the Phaedo, we're untethering the spirit with the dying process.
Right.
Could that be seen as a moral good, as a potential service to our modern psyche by exploring this vampire stuff?
Oh, I see.
As an agent of death. I mean, Edward's even diamonds, right? He's very pure.
Yeah.
Death, so.
I don't think it is in the Twilight series, and certainly not in Let Me In. I think the encounter with the monster can be purifying. In a tale like Polidori's, where again it's very clear that the monster is a monster, that he represents moral evil, that he's despoiling feminine virtue. It's clear where you stand in a tale like that, right? And one can be cleansed by a tale like that. I don't see how one is going to be cleansed in a tale like Let Me In, that is simply saying we're all predatory beasts.
Right. So maybe there's different kinds of vampire stories. There's that some are more beneficial.
And probably,
I see.
And probably more. These aren't all the same tale.
Right.
But I think a certain sort of vampire story can be quite edifying and cleansing in the way you're suggesting.
One that would have that passageway up to purgatory.
That's right.
Right. So without that passageway, then it's a dead end story.
Or at least
it doesn't do any good to the psyche.
Yeah, even if the story itself doesn't go all that way, it suggests that this is an evil.
Right.
In clear terms. That's what's being lost.
Right. So that's what's lost. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
So in the sense of the morality and the purification and everything, looking at these as works of literature or film, do you think the producers of these arts are reflecting or influencing society at large? Are they like reflecting that as society changes, or the title is sucking the life from our children as they're influencing the preteen level?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's both. I mean, they are certainly, I mean, from the early 19th century when Polidori was writing until now, there have certainly been great cultural shifts in Western and U.S. culture. We've been talking about them, but just to name them once again, I mean, where a culture is sort of rooted in virtue as sort of its primary value, to a culture that it's not only not rooted in virtue, but doesn't know what it is and may not even care anymore. That's a big cultural shift. I think an author like Stephanie Myers, who has had far more than Matt Reeves, the director of Let Me In, but Stephanie Myers is enjoying a huge influence on popular culture. I mean, she's drinking up the culture to a certain extent. I don't know how theoretically, but she's drinking it in. But she's also influencing it to a huge extent. I mean, she wouldn't be having such an influence if she couldn't tell a good story. She can tell a good story. I mean, I was pretty impressed reading Twilight, that it wasn't quite as wooden as I thought it was going to be. It has some pretty painful parts, but she can tell a story. She can get the story going, and it's captivating. So she is having that influence, but it's not as though she or any group of authors is creating the cultural situation. They're reflecting it as well, especially a film like Let Me In. It's probably reflecting more than it actually is creating. That's a good question. All right.
Kind of along with that, I was curious whether you had any thoughts on why, given the seemingly overwhelming push in our culture to embrace your nature, kind of whatever it is you think you are, you should do that.
Right.
Why Twilight is so much more popular than a nihilistic kind of story like Let Me In. When in Let Me In, she really is embracing her nature as a vampire, and she's doing whatever she has to do. Yeah. And in Twilight, they're kind of rejecting their natures. That's right.
That's right. Yet they are, but, and this is, I didn't show it. There's a great quote from Stephanie Meyer. Let me see if I can get it very quickly. I think can help explain that apparent contradiction. Yeah. Here's Stephanie Meyer herself on her own website saying, "The apple on the cover of Twilight represents forbidden fruit. I used the scripture from Genesis because I love the phrase, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Isn't that exactly what Bella ends up with? A working knowledge of what good is and what evil is by biting the apple." Right? In the end, I love the beautiful simplicity of the picture. To me, it says choice. Right? So even though you're right, and this, if you see my notes, you can see me struggling with this too. They have a nature that they have to restrain, right? His vampire nature, her human nature, it has to be restrained. But that is an act of choice for their love. So I see Twilight, it's really praising self-actualization and authenticity, right? Not straightforwardly out of nature, but out of choice. Right? That's at least a stab at an answer to that. Does that make some sense? And I think that's part of what is making it so popular.
Right? So actually, kind of, you might bring it down to two different camps of free choice, or free will and determinism.
Yeah, right.
The girl in Let Me In is sort of determined.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Here, and again, I think the Mormon background is influencing this. To exercise choice, they have to act against prohibitions. And I think that's what makes Twilight so funny. So anyway, Brian, do you have your hand?
Yeah, I think Let Me In is actually a well-made film.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I enjoyed the experience.
Yeah.
I wonder if the reason that it wasn't as popular as the Twilight series, if one of the reasons isn't that we're just behind the curve on this. Yeah. I mean, after all, if there's a novel written in Swedish, and apparently there must have been enough popular response to that to make a film. Right. And then somebody in Hollywood looks at that and says, wow, look at the response. Right. We could make some money off of this too. Right. And so then you make the film in English. Right. So does that suggest that, well, we're just behind Sweden, that's all? We have,
Oh, I see.
you see what I mean?
Yeah.
We're behind the curve in that sense. We
Right.
just haven't caught up with where they are in sort of
Yeah.
this nihilism.
That may be true. I mean, I think we have nihilistic tales of our own, though.
Mhm.
I mean, we have No Country for Old Men. It's not a vampire tale, but we may be behind the curve in seeing our monsters as nihilistic figures, though we've got plenty of nihilistic tales of our own. So I don't know. I mean, we can talk about how America as a culture is sort of not has declined as much as Europe. I think there's truth to that generally. So I think I can agree generally with what you're saying. And it could be that we're going to develop more and more of a taste for the kind of nihilistic tale that Let Me In is. Though again, I take it as a sign of health that it's not going to make as much money as a Twilight, because we're still yearning for love more than death, and that's something to hang your hat on. Not a whole lot in that version, but something.
Is there any other tales you can think of, or movies that you can think of, where the vampire is actually the hero in the story? Because in all these past vampire stories, he's still a villain. He's still
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all of them, you know, I mean, wouldn't you say that all of the current crop, the vampire, I mean, is still deadly, dangerous, but not being seen as evil incarnate, right? I mean, if you think of, what is it from?
Vampire Diaries.
Yeah, the Vampire Diaries, and what's the other one I'm thinking of? True Blood. I mean, this is sort of, you know, I'm being flip, but it's kind of friends with fangs, right? I mean, you know, it's a bunch of young people and they're living their lives and they're vampires, but that's not Polidori. It's still not Polidori's story. I'm exaggerating, man. But
I haven't read any of these things.
Good.
Don't
stop reading.
Sort of a disclaimer, but it does seem to me, in my experience, if something's immensely popular, then the story is not new.
Yes.
If something's immensely popular, there is a myth underlying it, or a tradition underlying it, religious or otherwise, that's as old as humanity.
That's right. I agree.
So, if therefore, my instinct would be that there's nothing new in Twilight.
Right.
I would compare it to something like in Watership Down, the rabbits are the people and the people are monsters. And I would say, from what I've heard of Twilight, the vampires are the people and the people are something else.
Yeah, right.
So whoever are the heroic figures in a story, they're the people. They're the ones that we identify with.
Right.
So it seems to me that this, again, as an outsider, it seems to me what's going on here is you have a man and a woman who are coming to terms with the otherness of the person of the other gender. Right. They're strange and they're dangerous, and yet they somehow apparently overcome that, right, and marry and have a family. I mean, that's a pretty old story.
Right. And again, I think on the most popular level, that explains the phenomenon. I agree. But I mean, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think that for most readers, that's what explains the phenomenon. It's not sort of what she's trying to do with Mormon imagery. It's what you say.
Dan, picking up on.
But is your point though that that's not very dangerous in this case, at least?
Yeah, I guess it doesn't. Again, I haven't read it, but
yeah.
But what was really moving people is a very old story.
Right.
And so the fact that there's a vampire as one of the principles doesn't seem dangerous to me.
Is not so essential. Right.
Well, he's not a functional vampire. Is that right? He doesn't actually take people's blood except if they're willing and
He does.
marry.
He says quickly in the scene that we saw that he and his family, not literally family, but they kind of function as a family, only feed on animals' blood at this point. So they're kind of the virtuous vampires. They're sort of the liberal democratic version of the vampire. I mean they're enlightened vampires, and they restrain themselves from eating humans, and they're sort of the elite. And even more than that, they sort of have this kind of divine status. And so, yeah, I'm thinking through this because it's a really good point. That it is the basic romantic tale that has always attracted humanity that is in play in Twilight. But I just don't know if I want to say that what's happening here is the same thing as what's happening in Jane Austen again, where it's very clear that you have that romantic love has to be tempered by virtue if it's going to flourish. I'm not sure that's what we have in Edward and Bella, but I have to keep thinking about that. That's a good point.
Well, just picking up on that point, I mean, it's not as though the heroes in Jane Austen's books have to become vampires to have a really. I haven't seen the movies and read the books, but
yeah.
I mean, if this is sort of love at its highest form, sort of portrayed in the series, then that's also disturbing because then it suggests that, that as humans, we really can't function. We can't attain something.
I see. Yeah.
So there's sort of a transhumanism there.
Yeah. Right.
Which is, I would say, just as well. I mean, I haven't read it, but that may be the darker side of Twilight.
Well, it might be the Mormon side of Twilight too. As much as I understand, we become like God. I mean, Aquinas says we become like gods in heaven, but that's understood in kind of a different way. Within Mormon, we have to become divine, and it seems to me that's what happens to Bella in the story is that she becomes a vampire and she becomes one of the elect. And that, again, in the Mormon context, is disturbing to me. But anyway, that's. Yes.
If art is a metaphysical activity, what's the larger picture here? What is happening in our culture philosophically that is leading this proliferation of? I mean, is there a larger picture, or is this just a small group in Hollywood that's hammering this out and trying to change the culture, or is it because we're experiencing something, some kind of malaise, or what is your?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think it's some cabal in Hollywood other than those who see vampire things making money and think, how do we get on this bandwagon? I don't think it's too terribly reflective of the level of the industry. I do think it reflects a perennial concern with death, and with the Gothic, that is sort of with dark things, hidden things. Monsters, again, that's a perennial concern of human beings, and so again, that's not new, but that's why the vampire phenomenon comes in waves. Right? What has crested for us, as I said, is only one wave out of many, even in the past 50 years in American popular culture, having to do with vampires. So it reflects perennial concerns, though it always has. It also reflects something of the present, as Let Me In reflects kind of the tendencies of our culture toward nihilism, for example.
Is there anything that can be done if we see this as or some of these interpretations as a negative form of eros? Is there anything that can be improved?
Well, the only thing to do in the face of stories is to tell better stories. I mean, there's. Which I take. I mean, if you're talking about how can we tell ourselves better stories, we need the story to do it, not so much. I mean, this kind of venue can go far in helping us understand what the popular culture is doing, but to have the kind of impact that a Stephanie Meyer has or a Hollywood film has, one needs to get into the storytelling business, like I did. So that would be my answer to that. Great questions.
Well, we're about out of time. Thank you very much. Let's thank Daniel again.